For 12 years, the United States of America was a different country. Black men sat in the United States Senate. Black men governed states. Black men wrote laws that white men had to follow. Black children attended public schools built by black legislators who had been enslaved a decade before. It was the closest this country has ever come to the democracy it claims to be. Then it was destroyed. Not because it failed, because it worked. And what replaced it was deliberately built on the lie that it had failed. A lie so thoroughly constructed and so aggressively maintained that most Americans still believe it. This is the story of what actually happened, what was actually built, what was deliberately destroyed, and why the lie about it has outlasted almost everything else from that era except the consequences. The morning of April 9th, 1865 was a Sunday. Robert E. Lee rode out to meet Ulysses Grant at a farmhouse in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, wearing his best uniform and carrying his ceremonial sword, dressed for a surrender he had spent the previous several days refusing to accept was necessary. He had approximately 27,000 men left. Grant had 113,000. The arithmetic was not a debate. Lee signed the surrender terms at approximately 2 in the afternoon. The terms were generous by any standard. Confederate officers could keep their sidearms. Men who owned their horses could keep them. Nobody was to be tried for treason. Grant ordered his men not to celebrate when the news spread through the Union lines, because, he wrote, the rebels were again our countrymen. It was a sentence that would define and trouble everything that came next, because the question of what our countrymen meant, what it required, and what it permitted was going to determine the fate of 4 million people who had been property when the war started and were legally free when it ended. Lee's surrender did not end the war immediately. Other Confederate armies were still in the field. General Joseph Johnston did not surrender in North Carolina until April 26th. Richard Taylor surrendered in Alabama on May 4th. Kirby Smith surrendered the last significant Confederate force in Texas on June 2nd. Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who had fled Richmond when Union forces entered the city in early April, was captured in Georgia on May 10th, wearing what Union soldiers and the Northern press immediately described as women's clothing, a detail that may or may not have been accurate, but that was repeated so widely it became the defining image of the Confederacy's end. Davis was imprisoned at Fort Monroe in Virginia for 2 years. He was never tried. The treason charges against him were eventually dropped in 1869, when it became clear that a Virginia jury was not going to convict him, and a conviction was not something the government was prepared to pursue through the years of appeals a conviction would require. He lived until 1889. He spent his final decades writing a defense of the Confederacy and the cause for which it had fought, a cause he continued to insist had been just. But on that Sunday morning at Appomattox, none of that had happened yet. What had happened was that the war that had killed approximately 620,000 Americans, a death toll that exceeds the combined American casualties of every other war the country has fought, was effectively over. The question that replaced it, the question that was going to dominate American politics for the next 12 years, and that the country has never fully resolved, was this. What does the peace mean? Not for the soldiers going home, white soldiers on both sides who were going to re-enter a society with varying degrees of disruption to their previous lives. For the 4 million people the war had been fought about. What did peace mean for them? What did freedom mean? What did citizenship mean? What did America mean now that the institution that had defined and distorted American democracy since the Constitution was signed had been destroyed? These were not rhetorical questions. They were practical ones. They required answers in the immediate term, in the weeks and months after Appomattox, before the former Confederate states were readmitted to the Union, before the legal and political framework of the post-war South was established, before the windows that a Union victory had opened either expanded into something real or closed forever. Abraham Lincoln had been thinking about these questions for months. His second inaugural address, delivered in March 1865 with the war not yet over, was remarkable in ways that his contemporaries recognized and that later generations have enshrined as his finest rhetoric. malice toward none, charity for all. But the address was also careful, almost evasive, about the specific mechanisms of what came next. Lincoln's Reconstruction plan, the one he had been implementing in the states the Union controlled since 1863, was lenient in ways that alarmed radical Republicans in Congress, the faction of his own party that believed the Confederate states had forfeited their status through rebellion and needed to be reconstructed from the foundation before readmission. Lincoln required only 10% of a state's 1860 voters to swear loyalty oaths before that state could form a new government. Congress passed the Wade-Davis Bill in 1864 requiring 50%. Lincoln Pocket vetoed it. On April 11, 1865, 2 days after Appomattox, Lincoln delivered what turned out to be the last public speech of his life, from a window of the White House to a crowd gathered on the lawn. In it, for the first time, he publicly endorsed suffrage for black men, at least for those who were educated or had served in the Union military. It was a cautious formulation. It was also, for 1865, a position no sitting president had ever taken publicly before. In the crowd that night was a 26-year-old actor named John Wilkes Booth. Booth heard Lincoln's words and turned to his companion David Harold and said in a voice several nearby witnesses later recalled, "That means in citizenship. That is the last speech he will ever make." 3 days later, on the evening of April 14th, Booth walked into Ford's Theater in Washington, entered the presidential box where Lincoln was watching a comedy called Our American Cousin, and shot him once in the back of the head with a single-shot Derringer pistol. Lincoln died at 7:22 the following morning in a boarding house across the street from the theater. He was 56 years old. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, standing at the bedside, said, "Now he belongs to the ages." It was the right thing to say, and it was also, accidentally, a description of the problem. Lincoln belonged to the ages. What the country needed him for was the next 12 years. What he would have done in those years, whether his approach would have been wiser or more effective than what followed, is one of the great unanswerable questions of American history. What can be said is that what followed was shaped by a man who was almost perfectly wrong for the moment, in ways that the moment would make catastrophically clear. Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president, a Tennessee Democrat who had been placed on the ticket in 1864 as a gesture of wartime national unity. A Southern Unionist who had opposed secession not because he opposed slavery, but because he thought secession was foolish and illegal. A man who had owned enslaved people himself, and who had stated his views on race with a directness that left no interpretive room. Johnson believed, and said so repeatedly in private and occasionally in public, that the United States was a white man's government, that black people were inherently inferior, that the war had been fought to preserve the Union, not to remake its racial order, and that anyone who thought otherwise had misunderstood what had happened and what it entitled anyone to do next. He had been visibly drunk at Lincoln's second inauguration 2 months earlier, drunk enough that Lincoln's aides had been embarrassed, and Lincoln himself had asked that Johnson not appear at public events for several weeks afterward. This was the man who now held the presidency. Johnson announced his Reconstruction plan in May 1865, while Congress was out of session. He had until December before Congress convened. 7 months to shape the terms of Southern readmission before the legislative branch could object. He used them. His plan required former Confederate states to ratify the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery and repudiate their secession ordinances. Beyond that, remarkably little. Former Confederates who swore loyalty oaths received pardons. Men who had owned more than $20,000 in property, the planter class that had led the Confederacy, had to apply for individual pardons from Johnson directly, a requirement he initially presented as a meaningful restriction and then undermined by approving virtually every application that crossed his desk, often in batches of hundreds at a time. By the fall of 1865, thousands of men who had led the rebellion were pardoned. Former Confederate generals were back in public life. Alexander Stephens, who had been the vice president of the Confederacy, who had delivered the cornerstone speech in 1861, declaring that the Confederacy's foundations were built on the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, was elected by Georgia to the United States Senate before the year was out. The former Confederate states responded to Johnson's leniency with a clarity of intent that should have settled every remaining question about what the South intended to do with its black population now that slavery was legally ended. They passed the Black Codes, not in secret, not apologetically. In open legislative session, in the fall and winter of 1865, state by state across the former Confederacy, with a speed and a comprehensiveness that demonstrated these were not improvised responses, but prepared ones, plans that had been in development since it became clear the war was ending badly. Mississippi's Black Code, among the first and most severe, was enacted in November 1865. It required all black residents to carry written proof of employment at the start of each year. Any black person found without employment on January 1st could be arrested for vagrancy and leased to a white employer who would pay their fine in exchange for their labor. Formerly enslaved children, whose parents were deemed unable to support them, could be bound as apprentices to white employers, with preference given to their former enslavers. Black Mississippians could not own land in cities, could not own firearms, could not serve on juries, could not testify against white defendants, could not assemble in groups without white supervision. The code did not use the word slavery. It did not have to. The functional relationship it created between black labor and white control was legible to everyone who read it. South Carolina's code required black workers to have written contracts for agricultural labor. Workers who left before the contract expired forfeited wages already earned. Louisiana's code was more direct. It required that workers address employers as master and mistresses and obey them in all matters. Texas, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, each state produced its own version, varying in specific detail and uniform in fundamental purpose. The purpose was to reconstitute as much of the labor control of slavery as the 13th Amendment's language permitted, using the exception the amendment itself provided, the exception that allowed involuntary servitude as punishment for crime, as the legal foundation for a system of criminalized black existence that could then be used to compel exactly the kind of labor that emancipation had ended. The Union Army officers still occupying the South watched this happen with reactions that ranged from outrage to indifference depending on the officer. Some refused to enforce the codes. Some enforced them enthusiastically. General Carl Schurz, sent south by Johnson in the summer of 1865 to assess conditions, reported back that the former Confederate states showed no evidence of genuine loyalty to the Union and that the black population was in urgent need of federal protection. Johnson suppressed the report. He did not want what Schurz had found. He had gone south expecting to confirm his own view that the situation was manageable and that Southern whites could be trusted to treat their black neighbors fairly once the war was over. What Schurz found did not confirm that view. So the report was buried. Into this landscape of systematically reimposed racial control came the Freedmen's Bureau. Officially, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, created by Congress on March 3, 1865, 1 month before Appomattox, the Bureau was the first federal social welfare agency in American history. Its mandate was staggering in scope, and its resources were inadequate to that scope from the first day of its existence. It was supposed to manage the transition of 4 million people from slavery to freedom. It was supposed to distribute food, clothing, and fuel to the destitute. Adjudicate labor disputes between black workers and white employers who had just spent their entire lives treating black labor as something owned rather than something purchased. Establish schools, manage hospitals, process land claims, provide legal assistance, negotiate labor contracts, supervise elections. Do all of this in a region that had just fought a war to prevent anything like it from happening, with a staff that at its peak numbered approximately 900 agents spread across the entire former Confederacy, a ratio of agents to freed people of approximately 1 to 4,000. The Bureau's most consequential promise, the one that raised the highest hopes and whose failure produced the deepest wound, preceded the Bureau itself. On January 16, 1865, 3 months before the war ended and 7 weeks before Congress formally created the Bureau, General William Tecumseh Sherman had issued Special Field Order No. 15. It set aside approximately 400,000 acres of land along the South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida coasts, land that had been abandoned by Confederate planters fleeing the Union advance, for the settlement of formerly enslaved people. Each family would receive 40 acres. The Army would loan them mules from its stock, 40 acres and a mule. The phrase entered American history as a symbol of a promise. It was a real order, issued by a real general with the authority to issue it, and approximately 40,000 black families moved onto that land in the spring and summer of 1865 and began to farm it. In the fall of 1865, Andrew Johnson revoked the order. He directed the Bureau to remove the black families who had settled on the land and return it to its former Confederate owners, who had been pardoned and whose property rights Johnson had decided took precedence over the claims of the people who had worked that land for generations as unpaid labor. General Oliver Howard, the Bureau's commissioner, was sent to South Carolina to deliver the news. The meeting he described in his memoirs was one of the most painful of his life. He stood before an assembly of freed people on Edisto Island who had received his agency's assurances that the land was theirs. They had planted crops. They had built structures. They had established communities. Howard told them the land was being returned to their former enslavers. They were silent for a moment. Then they began to sing, a hymn that the moment had apparently made the only possible response. Howard could not finish his speech. He wept. The taking back of the land was not merely a broken promise. It was a structural decision about what freedom would mean in the United States. Land is not just an economic asset. In an agricultural economy, land is the foundation of independence. A family that owns 40 acres can feed itself, can grow a surplus, can enter the market as a seller rather than only as a laborer. A family without land in an agricultural economy has no choice but to sell its labor. The choice of buyer determines the terms. In the post-war South, with the black codes in place, and the former enslaver class restored to their plantations and pardoned by the president, the terms available to black agricultural laborers who owned no land and had no other options were terms that the enslavers set. The taking back of Sherman's land was the decision to ensure that those terms remained the only terms available. Frederick Douglass understood this with the precision of a man who had been thinking about freedom longer and more carefully than anyone in the country. Douglass had been born into slavery in Maryland, had taught himself to read in secret, had escaped north in 1838, had become the most important black intellectual and orator of the 19th century, had spent the war years advising Lincoln and recruiting black soldiers for the Union Army. He came to Washington in the spring of 1866 to meet with Andrew Johnson and advocate for black suffrage, accompanied by a delegation of black leaders. Johnson received them politely. He told them that black suffrage was a matter for the states to decide. He told them that the interests of white and black workers were fundamentally opposed and that forcing the issue would produce racial conflict. Douglass left the meeting and gave a speech immediately afterward in which he described Johnson's argument as exactly the kind of reasoning that slavery had always used to justify itself. The oppressor's argument that the oppressed were better off without freedom, were not ready for freedom, would use freedom to harm the people from whom freedom was being withheld. Douglass had been making this argument for 30 years. He was going to have to make it for 30 more. But in 1866, something was changing in Washington that was going to give the argument more power than it had ever had before. Congress had come back into session in December 1865. The Republicans who dominated Congress had spent the fall watching Andrew Johnson pardon Confederates and watching the Southern states pass black codes and watching Alexander Stephens arrive at the Capitol prepared to take his Senate seat, and had reached the conclusion, not unanimous and not immediate, but decisive, that the president's version of Reconstruction was not Reconstruction at all. It was restoration. The restoration of the people who had tried to destroy the Union to the positions of power they had held before the war, with the modification that the people they had previously enslaved were now technically free and practically returned to a condition of servitude indistinguishable from the one the war had ended. The radical Republicans were not a unified bloc with a single agenda. They ranged from the genuinely committed, men like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, who who had been fighting for black equality for decades before the war made it a political possibility, to the opportunistically motivated, men who understood that readmitting the South under Johnson's terms would return the Democratic Party to national power and end Republican dominance. What united them was the conviction that what Johnson had done was insufficient, that the former Confederate states had demonstrated in the 6 months since Appomattox that left to their own devices, they would reconstruct as much of the antebellum racial order as the 13th Amendment's text permitted, and that the federal government had both the constitutional authority and the moral obligation to prevent that. What they were about to do had never been done before in American history. They were going to attempt, through legislation and constitutional amendment, and the occupation of a region by federal troops, to rebuild a society from the ground up. To take a society built on the premise of black inferiority and forced labor and replace it, by law and by force, and by the specific vision of men who had been thinking about what freedom actually required for longer than the war had lasted, with something approaching a genuine multiracial democracy. It was the most radical political project in the history of the United States. It produced, for 12 extraordinary years, results that should have been impossible, given how recently the society had been organized around the opposite premise. What it produced, what was built in those 12 years, is the part of this story that has been buried most deliberately. Because you cannot construct the myth that Reconstruction was a failure, the myth that justified everything done to end it, if the record of what Reconstruction actually built is clearly visible. So the record was buried, the achievements were minimized. The people who made them were erased or caricatured. The historians who constructed the mythology that replaced the truth did their work so thoroughly that for most of the 20th century, the story most Americans were taught about Reconstruction was not just incomplete. It was the story the people who destroyed Reconstruction wanted, told about what they had destroyed. That story is wrong. What was built was real. What was built matters, and what was done to it, and why, and how the cover-up of what was done shaped American history for the next 150 years is what this documentary is about. The radical Republicans were coming, and for a moment, just long enough to build something permanent, enough that it took 20 years of organized terror to bring it down, America was going to become what it had always claimed to be. On February 5th, 1866, Andrew Johnson vetoed the Civil Rights Act. He sent it back to Congress with a message explaining his reasoning in language that required no decoding. The bill, he wrote, discriminated against white people by conferring citizenship on black Americans. The federal government, he argued, had no constitutional authority to define citizenship at all. Black Americans, he said, had not demonstrated the qualifications necessary for citizenship, and should not be granted it by legislative fiat. He used the word discrimination as if the people who had been enslaved 24 months earlier were the ones imposing something on those who had enslaved them. The message was received in Congress with a fury that Johnson had not anticipated, and that changed the course of American history. The House voted to override the veto 72 hours after receiving it. The Senate followed. For the first time in American history, Congress had overridden a presidential veto on a major piece of legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 became law without the president's signature. It defined American citizenship for the first time in the Constitution's history, establishing that all persons born in the United States, regardless of race, were citizens with full and equal rights under the law. It was a remarkable achievement. It was also, the radical Republicans immediately understood, a fragile one. A statute can be repealed. The next Congress could pass a different statute. The next president, or this one in some other form, could find ways to undermine its enforcement. If what the Civil Rights Act said was going to mean anything permanent, it needed to be in the Constitution itself. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution was drafted in the spring of 1866 and sent to the states for ratification. Section 1 was the constitutional architecture the Civil Rights Act had attempted in statute. All persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens. No state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person the equal protection of the laws. These 43 words of the Equal Protection Clause became the most litigated phrase in the history of American constitutional law. Every civil rights case, every challenge to discriminatory legislation, every argument about what the Constitution requires of a state in its treatment of its citizens runs back to this sentence. Written in 1866 by men who were watching Andrew Johnson pardon Confederate generals and Southern legislatures reinstate racial bondage, and who understood that without a constitutional foundation, nothing they built would survive the next shift in political winds. Tennessee ratified the amendment in July 1866 and was promptly readmitted to the Union. The other former Confederate states, operating under Johnson's encouragement and their own contempt for what Congress was demanding of them, refused. The refusal made the next question unavoidable. If the Southern states would not ratify the 14th Amendment voluntarily, what was the federal government prepared to do about it? The congressional elections of November 1866 provided the answer. The radical Republicans won 2/3 majorities in both chambers. The supermajority required to override presidential vetoes without a single vote to spare. Johnson could veto everything they passed. It no longer mattered. Congress was now, constitutionally, the dominant branch of the federal government. What it did with that dominance in the spring of 1867 was the beginning of what historians call radical Reconstruction, the most ambitious attempt at imposed social transformation in American history. The Reconstruction Acts of March 1867 divided the former Confederate states, except for Tennessee, which had already been readmitted, into 5 military districts, each commanded by a Union general with broad authority over civilian life. The acts laid out the conditions for readmission. Each state had to call a constitutional convention. The delegates to that convention had to be elected by all male citizens, regardless of race. The Constitution produced by the convention had to guarantee black male suffrage. The state had to ratify the 14th Amendment. Only then would Congress consider readmitting the state and withdrawing the military government. The acts also barred from voting and office-holding former Confederate officials who had previously sworn oaths to the federal Constitution and then violated those oaths by supporting the rebellion. This provision, aimed at the antebellum political leadership of the South, was the mechanism by which the Reconstruction governments achieved their extraordinary political character. When black men registered to vote in the former Confederate states in the fall and winter of 1867, they did so in numbers that transformed the electorate overnight. In South Carolina, black registered voters outnumbered white registered voters. In Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Louisiana, and Georgia, black registration was massive and immediate. The registration of men who had been watching elections for their entire lives while being prohibited from participating, who understood exactly what a vote was and what it was worth, and who were not going to waste it. The Union League, a Republican political organization that spread through black communities in the South during this period, organized the registration drives, held political meetings in churches and fields and barns, educated new voters about the mechanics of the ballot and the stakes of the elections, and the specific Republican positions that differed from the Democratic ones. The meetings were sometimes held in secret because the men attending them were already being threatened for attending. They came anyway, in extraordinary numbers, because the alternative to the threat was the situation that had existed before, and that situation was the situation that had produced the threat, and they were not going back to it. The Constitutional Conventions of 1867 and 1868 were unlike anything that had ever assembled in the American South, or, arguably, anywhere in the world. In South Carolina, 76 of the 124 delegates elected to the Constitutional Convention were black. They were formerly enslaved men and freeborn black men and black veterans of the Union Army. They were literate and illiterate, formally educated, and entirely self-taught. They were men who a year earlier had been legally prohibited from testifying in court, from owning firearms, from assembling without white supervision, from doing the thing they were now doing, which was writing the foundational law of the state that had fired the first shots of the Civil War. The Constitution they produced was not a radical document in its economic provisions. It did not confiscate planter land or redistribute wealth in the structural ways that Thaddeus Stevens had been advocating. What it did was establish for the first time in South Carolina's history a system of public education available to all citizens, reform the state's tax code to shift the burden toward property owners rather than laborers, abolish imprisonment for debt, reform the criminal code, and create institutions of public welfare that had not previously existed. It was, by the standards of 1868, a genuinely progressive document, more democratic in several respects than the Constitution it replaced, written by men who had the most direct possible interest in what a democratic constitution needed to contain. Mississippi's convention produced a constitution that was so progressive in its provisions that Mississippi's white conservative minority mounted a campaign to defeat it at ratification and succeeded temporarily, delaying Mississippi's readmission until 1870. Alabama's convention, Texas's, Georgia's, each producing documents that reflected the specific political landscape of the state and the specific balance of delegates, but all sharing the foundational commitment to equal citizenship and black suffrage that the Reconstruction Acts had made prerequisite. The men who emerged from these conventions and from the elections that followed them into the legislatures and constitutional offices of the reconstructed South constituted a generation of black political leadership that American history has worked very hard to make invisible. Not because they were ineffective, because they were effective. Because the story that justified destroying Reconstruction required the men who led it to be incompetent or corrupt or both, and the documentary record of what they actually did could not be reconciled with that story. So the record was minimized, the careers were omitted from textbooks, the speeches were not anthologized, the legislation was not credited, and the result was that most Americans today could not name a single black political figure from the Reconstruction era if their lives depended on it. This documentary intends to change that, at least partially, because these men deserve to be known by name and by deed. Hiram Revels. Born in 1827 in Fayetteville, North Carolina, to free black parents, educated at a Quaker seminary in Indiana and at Knox College in Illinois, ordained as a minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and by the time the war came, one of the most effective black recruiters of Union soldiers in the country, organizing regiments in Maryland and Missouri, and eventually serving as chaplain to a black regiment in Mississippi. After the war, he settled in Natchez, Mississippi, served on the Natchez City Council, and was elected to the state Senate. In January 1870, the Mississippi State Legislature elected him to the United States Senate to fill the unexpired term of a seat that had last been occupied by Albert Brown, a senator who had voted for secession and who had spent the previous 5 years trying to destroy the government whose upper chamber Revels was now about to enter. Revels was the first black man ever to serve in the United States Senate. He arrived in Washington and was met by crowds in the galleries of the Senate chamber. White senators from border states challenged his right to be seated. The challenge was debated and defeated. He sat in the seat that Jefferson Davis had vacated in 1861 when Mississippi left the Union. The symbolism was not lost on anyone and was reported in newspapers across the country and across the world. The man who had recruited soldiers to fight the Confederacy now sat in the chair of the man who had led it. Blanche Kelso Bruce. Born enslaved in Farmville, Virginia in 1841 to a white planter father and an enslaved mother, educated by a private tutor provided to his white half-brother who permitted Bruce to sit in on the lessons, who escaped to freedom during the war, established himself in Mississippi after it, became a planter, a sheriff, a tax collector, and in 1875 was elected by the Mississippi legislature to a full 6-year term in the United States Senate. He served that full term. He was the only black man to serve a complete Senate term until Edward Brooke of Massachusetts in 1967, 92 years later. During his Senate tenure, Bruce chaired the Committee on River Improvements, advocated for the rights of Chinese immigrants being targeted by discriminatory legislation, and delivered a Senate floor speech on the Exodus of 1879, the movement of black Americans from the Deep South to Kansas that stands as one of the most precisely argued addresses on the relationship between racial violence and population movement in the Senate's history. Pinckney Benton Stuart Pinchback. The name is worth saying in full. because it suited him. Born in Macon, Georgia in 1837, the son of a white planter named William Pinchback and an enslaved woman named Eliza, whom his father freed and took north. His father died when Pinchback was 12, and the white relatives immediately attempted to re-enslave Pinchback and his siblings on the grounds that their mother had been formerly enslaved, and therefore they were property, regardless of their father's intentions. The family escaped. Pinchback made his way to New Orleans, worked on riverboats, enlisted in the Union Army when the war began, organized a company of black soldiers, resigned his commission when the Army refused to allow black officers to command black troops, and emerged from the war as a politician of exceptional tactical intelligence. He served in the Louisiana State Senate, was elected Lieutenant Governor of Louisiana in 1871, and on December 9, 1872, when Governor Henry Warmoth was suspended pending impeachment proceedings, Pinchback became acting governor of Louisiana. For 35 days, Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback was the governor of Louisiana, the first black governor in American history. He was not the last, but the gap between him and the second one was 117 years. Robert Brown Elliott, the most electrifying orator of the Reconstruction era, a man whose origins are genuinely mysterious, claimed by some accounts to have been born in Boston and educated partly at Eton College in England, claims whose documentation is uncertain enough that historians have debated them for generations, a debate that Elliott's enemies in his own time used to undermine him, and that the uncertainty has never fully resolved. What is documented is his legal career in South Carolina, his election to the House of Representatives in 1870, his re-election in 1872, and the speech he delivered on the floor of the House on January 6, 1874, in defense of Charles Sumner's Civil Rights Bill. Alexander Stephens of Georgia, the former Confederate vice president, the man who had delivered the cornerstone speech declaring black inferiority. The foundation of the Confederacy had spoken against the bill. Elliott asked for the floor. He spoke for over an hour without notes, in a chamber so crowded that members were sitting in the aisles and standing against the walls, delivering a constitutional argument of such precision and rhetorical force that his colleagues rose and applauded when he finished, and newspapers across the country reprinted the speech in full. Stephens did not respond. He had left the chamber before Elliott finished. Joseph Hayne Rainey, born enslaved in Georgetown, South Carolina, in 1832. His father purchased the family's freedom. Rainey worked as a barber in Charleston, was conscripted by the Confederate Army to work on fortifications, escaped to Bermuda with his wife, returned to South Carolina after the war, entered politics, and on December 12, 1870, was sworn in as a member of the United States House of Representatives, becoming the first black man to serve in that body. He would serve 5 terms, be re-elected 4 times by the voters of South Carolina's 1st Congressional District, and during his tenure debate, white congressmen who questioned his right to be there with a precision and a patience that they had not expected and could not match. Robert Smalls. There is no story from the Reconstruction era more cinematic than his, and unlike many cinematic stories, it is entirely true. On the night of May 12, 1862, Robert Smalls was an enslaved man working as a wheelman, the term used because enslaved men were not given the title of pilot even when they performed all the functions of one, on the CSS Planter, a Confederate transport ship in Charleston Harbor. The white officers had gone ashore for the night. Smalls put on the captain's uniform and the captain's wide-brimmed straw hat. He gathered 15 enslaved people, including his wife and children, who had been hidden on the boat. At approximately 3 in the morning, he piloted the planter out of Charleston Harbor, giving the correct signals at each Confederate checkpoint, passing beneath the guns of Fort Sumter, and sailing into Union waters, where he surrendered the ship, its cargo of Confederate military equipment, and the detailed harbor knowledge in his head to the Union Navy. He was 23 years old. Congress voted him prize money for the captured vessel. He used it to purchase the house in Beaufort, South Carolina, where his mother had been enslaved and where he had been born into slavery. After the war, he served in the South Carolina State Legislature, was elected to 5 terms in the United States House of Representatives, and when an interviewer late in his life asked him how he had found the courage to sail out of Charleston Harbor past Confederate guns in the middle of the night, he said he had simply decided that if he was going to be free or die, and the choice was his to make, it might as well be that night. These men were not exceptions. They were part of a generation. Between 1870 and 1877, 2 black men served in the Senate, 14 served in the House, and hundreds served in state legislatures across the South. South Carolina sent more black members to Congress during Reconstruction than any other state and would not send another until 1973. Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Louisiana, North Carolina, each state producing black legislators, black judges, black sheriffs, black magistrates, black school board members, black city councilmen in numbers that had never previously existed in American political life and would not exist again for close to a century. They operated in a political environment that was hostile to them, that required constant negotiation with white Republican allies whose commitment to racial equality ranged from genuine to minimal, that exposed them to physical danger that was not hypothetical, that required them to accomplish through legislation what could only be sustained if the political conditions that made the legislation possible survived. The survival of those conditions was not guaranteed, and they knew it. They legislated with urgency. The 15th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified on February 3, 1870. It prohibited the denial of the right to vote on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It was greeted in black communities across the country with celebrations of a scale and an emotional intensity that contemporaries struggled to describe. In Baltimore, a parade of 10,000 people marched through the streets. In Philadelphia, the crowd was estimated at larger. Frederick Douglass, speaking at a celebration in Washington, called it the crowning achievement of the anti-slavery movement, the culmination of 30 years of work. He was right that it was an extraordinary achievement. He was also, in private correspondence from this period, aware of its limitations. The 15th Amendment prohibited voting discrimination based on race. It did not prohibit literacy tests. It did not prohibit poll taxes. It did not prohibit grandfather clauses or white primaries, or the specific administrative mechanisms that Southern states would later use to make the amendment's promise theoretical while making its guarantee meaningless. The men who drafted the amendment knew these vulnerabilities existed. They could not get the Senate votes to close them. What they could get was what they passed. What they passed was what they could defend at ratification. The compromise built into the amendment's text was the compromise that the political arithmetic of 1869 imposed. The Freedmen's Bureau schools were perhaps the most durable achievement of the Reconstruction era, the one whose effects were most difficult to entirely undo even after the political conditions that had produced them collapsed. By 1870, the Bureau had established approximately 3,000 schools across the former Confederacy, serving approximately 150,000 students. They ranged from one-room structures in rural communities, sometimes in the churches that had become the institutional center of black community life, to more substantial facilities in cities. They were staffed by an extraordinary combination of people: northern white missionaries and teachers, primarily women, who had come south with the conviction that the war had created an obligation to its survivors. Black teachers, some of them educated in the North before the war, others who had taught themselves to read in secret during slavery, and who were now teaching what had been taught to them. And formerly enslaved people who were learning and teaching simultaneously, adults attending school for the first time in their lives alongside children who had never known a world where school was forbidden to them. The hunger for education among the freed people was one of the documented phenomena of the Reconstruction era that contemporaries found astonishing regardless of their political views. White observers across the political spectrum reported on it, sometimes with admiration and sometimes with something less comfortable: the discomfort of people encountering evidence that contradicted assumptions they had held about the people in front of them. Elderly men and women who had been enslaved for 60 years and who would never be able to use what they learned in the ways younger people could, who had no economic future in which literacy was going to make a practical difference, were attending schools. When asked why, they gave answers that required no elaboration. Because we were not allowed to. Because they said we couldn't. Because we want to know what the words say. Because our children need us to know. The books that the Bureau schools provided were, in some cases, the first books that had ever been inside the cabins where freed people lived. They were treated accordingly. The schools fed into something larger. Howard University was founded in Washington in 1867, named for Oliver Howard, the Freedmen's Bureau Commissioner, who had wept at Edisto Island. Fisk University was founded in Nashville in 1866. Morgan State, Clark Atlanta, Morehouse, Spelman, Hampton, Tuskegee. The historically black colleges and universities that shaped black intellectual and professional life for the next century. Most of them were founded during Reconstruction or immediately after it, built on the foundation of the Bureau schools and the conviction that the freed people were entitled to the full range of educational opportunity that American life could provide. The white South worked systematically to destroy this conviction after Reconstruction ended. The institutions survived because the communities around them protected them in the same way they protected the churches, with the fierce possessiveness of people who understand that what is being protected is irreplaceable. Thaddeus Stevens, the man who understood more clearly than anyone else what Reconstruction needed to be, and who came closer than anyone else to making it that. Stevens was a Pennsylvania congressman, a veteran of decades of anti-slavery politics, a man whose private life included an arrangement that his contemporaries whispered about and his enemies used against him, a mixed-race housekeeper named Lydia Hamilton Smith, who had managed his household for 3 decades, and who was, in the understanding of many people who knew them, something more than his housekeeper. Stevens did not discuss the relationship publicly. He did not need to. His politics spoke loudly enough. He believed, with a consistency that never wavered from the day he entered Congress, that the fundamental problem of American democracy was the concentration of land and power in the hands of a planter aristocracy, and that the only solution was the redistribution of that land to the people who had worked it without compensation for generations. He wanted to confiscate the plantations, distribute them to the freed people, use the remaining land to fund public education. He said this not in private correspondence, but on the floor of Congress, in the plain language of a man who had spent his career saying what he meant and had reached an age at which he had no more patience for anything else. He did not get what he wanted. The confiscation of Confederate land was too radical for the majority of his Republican colleagues, who were committed to equal rights, but not to the structural economic transformation that Stevens understood was the only way to make those rights sustainable. Without land, black political power in the agricultural South depended on black labor remaining in proximity to white employers who had every interest in undermining that power. With land, black political independence was structurally possible, regardless of what white employers preferred. Stevens was right about the arithmetic. He was right, and he was outvoted. And he died in August 1868, before Reconstruction's achievements were complete, and before its destruction began, requesting to be buried in a black cemetery in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, because he wrote in the epitaph he composed for himself, in life he had championed equal rights for all, and could not in death violate those principles by lying in a cemetery that excluded people on the basis of race. He was buried where he asked to be buried. The principle he had championed in life was dismantled with organized thoroughness in the years immediately following his death. Charles Sumner. The other great radical, the senator from Massachusetts, who had been beaten nearly to death on the floor of the Senate in 1856 by a South Carolina congressman named Preston Brooks for delivering an anti-slavery speech, who had returned to his Senate seat after 2 years of recovery to find that Massachusetts had left it empty in his absence as a symbol of the crime that had been committed against him and against free speech, who had spent the remaining years of his political career pursuing a civil rights act that would guarantee black Americans equal access to public accommodations, railroads, hotels, theaters, schools, jury service, the complete integration into public life that the 14th Amendment promised, and that the political system was not yet willing to deliver. Sumner died in March 1874 before his bill passed. On his deathbed, he reportedly called out to colleagues who had come to see him, "You must take care of the Civil Rights Bill. Don't let it fail. The bill was passed the following year, in 1875, as a tribute to him, watered down from what he had wanted, but still the most comprehensive civil rights legislation the country had seen. It was struck down by the Supreme Court in 1883. The court's decision said that the 14th Amendment prohibited state discrimination, but not private discrimination. Hotels and theaters and railroads were private, the court said. They could discriminate freely. The bill Sumner had spent his last years fighting for was gone. He had been dead 9 years, and the country had already moved on to dismantling everything else he had built. But in the years between 1867 and 1875, before the dismantling was complete, something was operating in the American South that had not operated before and would not operate again for a very long time. A functioning, if imperfect and endangered, multiracial democracy. Black men voting in the millions. Black men legislating, governing, adjudicating, administering, doing everything that democratic citizenship requires. Black schools opening in counties where teaching a black child to read had been a crime a decade earlier. Black churches functioning as the organizational infrastructure of a community, building its political life for the first time. A constitutional framework, however fragile, that said plainly that citizenship was not conditioned on race, and that the federal government had both the authority and the obligation to enforce that principle. It was imperfect. It was endangered from the first day. It was real. And there were men who had decided, from the moment it became clear that it was real, that it could not be allowed to continue. Those men were organized, they were violent, they were patient, and they were coming. The lie about Reconstruction has a specific shape. It says that the governments produced by black suffrage and federal military oversight were corrupt, incompetent, dominated by ignorant freedmen, manipulated by cynical northern carpetbaggers, and unprincipled southern scalawags, that they taxed the honest white citizenry into ruin while pillaging the public treasury, that they were a punitive imposition on a defeated people rather than a legitimate democratic outcome, that the only honest verdict on them is failure. The lie was constructed with professional care by a specific group of historians beginning in the 1890s, taught in American schools and universities for most of the 20th century, embedded in the popular culture through novels and films and monuments, and received with the credulity that stories receive when they confirm what the people hearing them already want to believe. It is a lie. The documentary record of what the Reconstruction governments actually built, what they legislated, what they established, what they achieved against the specific obstacles they faced, contradicts it on every significant point. This chapter is that record. Start with the schools. Before Reconstruction, there was no public school system in the American South. Not an inadequate one. Not a segregated one. None. The antebellum South had made a deliberate choice about education. Private tutors for the children of planters, limited access for the white working class, and for the enslaved and free black populations. In most states, laws making it a criminal offense to teach a black person to read. The Southern economy did not require a literate workforce. It required a controllable one. Literacy and control were understood to be in tension, and the choice between them had been made clearly enough to write it into the criminal code. The Reconstruction governments in every former Confederate state built public school systems from nothing. South Carolina's Constitution of 1868 established compulsory public education funded by property taxes, the first such system in the state's history, open to children of all races. By 1876, according to state education records, approximately 50% of black school-age children in South Carolina were enrolled in school. The speed of that achievement, from 0 to 50% in 8 years, in a state that had made it a crime to teach black children to read 8 years earlier, is not the record of a failed government. It is the record of a government operating with extraordinary urgency in the face of extraordinary need. Mississippi built its first state institution for the mentally ill during Reconstruction, the Mississippi State Lunatic Asylum, which, unlike the institution in most southern states before the war, admitted patients regardless of race. Before Reconstruction, mentally ill black Mississippians had no public facility at all. The institution was one of several public welfare structures that Reconstruction governments established across the South. Hospitals and asylums, and poorhouses and orphanages that served populations that the antebellum governments had simply not considered their responsibility. These institutions were expensive. Their expense became one of the primary arguments used against the Reconstruction governments by their opponents, who described the increased state spending as corruption and mismanagement, without acknowledging what the spending was actually for, which was the creation, for the first time, of the basic infrastructure of a modern state that served all of its citizens. Louisiana went further than any other Reconstruction state on the question of racial integration. The Louisiana Constitution of 1868 mandated that all public schools be open to children of all races. It mandated equal access to public accommodations. It integrated the state university. New Orleans, under Reconstruction governance, operated an integrated school system for several years in which black and white children attended the same classrooms, taught by black and white teachers, in an arrangement that most of their parents had not grown up imagining was possible, and that functioned, by the accounts of both contemporaries and later historians who examined the records, with considerably less conflict than the mythology of inevitable racial incompatibility would have predicted. The Louisiana school integration was a direct precedent that the Supreme Court would decline to acknowledge when it ruled on school segregation 80 years later. It demonstrated, in practice, that integration was possible. It was dismantled after Reconstruction ended, precisely because the demonstration was inconvenient. The tax reform that funded these achievements is the specific mechanism that the Reconstruction government's critics attacked most effectively. And the attack succeeded partly because the reform was real, and the higher taxes that resulted were real, and partly because the story of who was paying them and why was not told alongside the story of the tax increases themselves. The antebellum Southern tax system had been built around taxing labor rather than land. Enslaved people were property, and property was taxed, which meant that the primary tax base of the antebellum South was its enslaved population. The planter who owned 1,000 acres and 200 enslaved people paid taxes on the 200 people and minimal taxes on the land. The taxes effectively fell on black labor, not on white wealth. Reconstruction governments reformed this. They shifted the tax burden toward land and away from labor, implementing property taxes that for the first time required large landowners to pay taxes on the land they owned. The planter class had paid almost nothing under the old system. Under Reconstruction, they paid significant amounts. Their descriptions of this as taxation without representation, as confiscatory policy, as evidence of corrupt governance, were the descriptions of people who had arranged a tax system to benefit themselves for generations and were experiencing for the first time what it felt like to pay for the government they lived under. The legitimate corruption that existed in Reconstruction governments was real, and the record of it should be acknowledged clearly because pretending it didn't exist serves the lie rather than the truth. Reconstruction governments were not pure. They operated in an environment of rampant patronage and influence trading that characterized American politics at every level during the Gilded Age, in the North as well as the South, in the Grant administration, as thoroughly as in any state capital. South Carolina's government, under Governor Robert Scott, had genuine scandals involving the issuance of railroad bonds, schemes in which the bonds were issued for more money than the authorized amounts, and the difference was distributed among participants. Mississippi had its own episodes of financial irregularity. The corruption existed. It was not the whole story, or the main story, or even a very large fraction of the story, and it was not significantly worse than the corruption operating simultaneously in the Tammany Hall governed New York of Boss Tweed, which no historian has used as evidence that democracy itself was a failed experiment. But the Reconstruction government's opponents did not need the corruption to be proportionally large. They needed it to exist, because its existence gave respectable cover to an argument whose actual motivation was the restoration of white supremacy and the elimination of black political power. The railroad question illustrates the complexity more clearly than almost anything else. Reconstruction governments across the South issued bonds to finance railroad construction, continuing a process that antebellum governments had begun and that the war had interrupted. Railroads were the economic infrastructure of the 19th century. A state without railroads was a state cut off from national markets, unable to move its agricultural products to port, unable to attract investment. The Reconstruction governments understood this and spent heavily on railroad development. Some of that spending was managed well and produced working railroads. Some of it was poorly managed and produced financial losses. Some of it was stolen. The criticism that resulted focused exclusively on the losses and the theft. Never on the working railroads. Never on the economic development that railroad access enabled. Never on the fact that the same criticisms, applied with the same selective attention to the contemporary railroad development programs in northern states, would have produced equally damning portraits of Republican governments in Illinois or Ohio or New York. The Republican Party of Reconstruction was not only the party of principle, it was also the party of interest. Northern Republicans who supported Reconstruction did so for a combination of reasons that included genuine moral commitment to black equality, practical understanding that black votes kept Republicans in power in the South, and economic interest in the reconstruction of the Southern economy as a market for Northern goods and investment. The carpetbagger, the Northern Republican who came South after the war to participate in Reconstruction politics or business, was a figure who existed across the full moral spectrum from genuine reformers to opportunistic exploiters, and the Southern opponents of Reconstruction made no distinctions between them, treating the entire category as synonymous with the worst examples within it. The scalawag, the white Southerner who supported Reconstruction, was the figure the opponents of Reconstruction most needed to discredit, because white Southern support for Reconstruction was the evidence that it was not simply an external imposition, but a genuine political coalition, representing real constituencies. Southern Unionists, white men who had opposed secession, who had sometimes fought for the Union, who had reasons of their own for wanting the planter class's dominance broken, were a real political force in every former Confederate state. Small farmers who had resented the planter aristocracy before the war, and who understood that their own economic interests were not identical to the plantation owners' interests, supported Reconstruction governments in significant numbers. The label scalawag, implying moral worthlessness and racial betrayal, was the mechanism by which this coalition was attacked culturally when it couldn't be defeated politically. Jonathan Jasper Wright. Born in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania in 1840, educated at Ithaca Academy in New York, admitted to the bar in Pennsylvania in 1865 as one of the first black attorneys admitted to the bar in that state, moved to South Carolina with the Freedmen's Bureau, was elected to the South Carolina State Senate in 1868, and was appointed in 1870 to the South Carolina Supreme Court, becoming the first black justice to serve on any state Supreme Court in American history. He served on the court for 7 years, writing opinions in cases involving contract law, property rights, and constitutional interpretation, functioning as what he was, which was a competent jurist in a court of law, in a state where it had recently been illegal to teach him to read. His tenure on the court ended in 1877, when Reconstruction ended in South Carolina, and the new government that replaced it found reasons to make his continuation on the bench untenable. He returned to private practice and died in 1885 at 45 years old. South Carolina did not seat another black Supreme Court justice for over a century. John Roy Lynch. Born enslaved in Concordia Parish, Louisiana in 1847, came to Mississippi after the war, taught himself to read and write, became a justice of the peace, was elected to the Mississippi State Legislature at 21, was elected Speaker of the Mississippi House of Representatives at 24, and was elected to the United States House of Representatives in 1872 at 25, making him one of the youngest members of Congress in the institution's history. He delivered a speech on the floor of the House in support of the Civil Rights Bill of 1875 that Frederick Douglass read and wrote about admiringly, a speech that made the constitutional case for federal civil rights legislation with a clarity and an economy of language that the bill's opponents could not answer substantively and did not try to. After Reconstruction ended, Lynch continued in Republican politics, served as a delegate to multiple Republican national conventions, argued with President Benjamin Harrison about patronage appointments, and in his later years wrote The Facts of Reconstruction, published in 1913, one of the earliest and most important scholarly responses to the lost cause interpretation of the era. A book that used documentary evidence to argue that what the textbooks were saying about Reconstruction was not what the records showed. He lived until 1939. He was 92 years old, and he had seen Birth of a Nation come out in 1915, and watched the Confederate monuments go up, and watched the textbooks teach his era as a cautionary tale about black incapacity, and he had written, with patient and documented fury, the rebuttal that academia was not yet ready to hear. The churches of Black America during Reconstruction were institutions that served so many simultaneous functions that listing them risks making them sound schematic when they were organic. The natural result of communities building around the institution that had always been available to them and expanding it to fill every need the moment created. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, founded in Philadelphia in 1816 by Richard Allen in explicit protest of the segregation of Philadelphia's white Methodist churches, had approximately 20,000 members before the Civil War, mostly in the North. By 1880, after 15 years of growth in the newly freed South, it had 400,000. The AME Church was one of the fastest growing religious organizations in American history during this period. It grew because it was the black institution that was already there when freedom came, that had the organizational structure and the theological tradition and the experienced leadership to absorb hundreds of thousands of new members and to serve as the institutional anchor for the communities those members were building. The church was the school before the Bureau School arrived, and remained the school in communities where the Bureau School never reached or didn't survive. It was the bank in communities where banks would not serve black depositors. It was the political organizing vehicle, the place where voter registration happened, and candidates were discussed, and political education was conducted, in a period when the distinction between the spiritual and the political was one that the black community could not afford to maintain, with the strictness that white churches of the same era applied to it. The distinction had never made practical sense for a community whose spiritual liberation and whose political liberation were the same event. When Reconstruction ended and the political sphere contracted for black Americans in ways that threatened to make it disappear entirely, the church was what remained. That is not accidental. The church had been built to remain. The black press expanded during Reconstruction with a speed that reflected both the hunger for information and the need for a communication infrastructure that white newspapers, which ranged from hostile to indifferent on matters of black interest, could not provide. The New Orleans Tribune had been founded in 1864 during the occupation of New Orleans and became the first black daily newspaper in the country, publishing simultaneously in English and French to reach the full range of Louisiana's black population, which included Creole communities with French as their primary language. The Charleston Advocate, the Colored American, the People's Advocate, papers in every major city of the South, and many smaller ones, reported on Reconstruction politics with the perspective and the specificity that the black communities consuming them needed. They covered the legislative sessions in detail. They reported on violence against black citizens in counties where no white newspaper would acknowledge the violence. They published the speeches of black politicians and the arguments of black attorneys and the statements of black community organizations. They constituted, taken together, a parallel information ecosystem that served a population the mainstream press had decided was not its audience. The labor question was the one Reconstruction never fully resolved, and the one that the failure to resolve it made everything else ultimately unsustainable. Thaddeus Stevens had been right about the land. Without land redistribution, the freed people remained economically dependent on the planter class for access to the only productive asset in the Southern agricultural economy, and economic dependence was the foundation on which political dependence could be reconstructed, regardless of what the constitutional amendments said. The Reconstruction governments tried various mechanisms to protect black labor from the worst exploitation. Labor conventions organized by freed people in the late 1860s produced demands for fair wages, reasonable hours, the right to organize, and written contracts, demands that were remarkably similar to the labor demands that the white working class in northern cities was making simultaneously through the nascent union movement and that received equally mixed responses from the governments of the era. Some Reconstruction state governments passed laws requiring written labor contracts, providing mechanisms for workers to sue for unpaid wages, and establishing minimum protections against the worst forms of exploitation. The laws were real. The enforcement was inconsistent. The underlying economic condition, which was black workers competing for work in an agricultural labor market controlled by former enslavers who had every incentive to maintain the lowest possible wages, was not one that legislation could fix without the structural economic change that Stevens had been trying to produce through land redistribution, and that the political system had refused to implement. What emerged instead was sharecropping, not as a legal system, as an economic arrangement that the conditions produced. A black family farmed a portion of a white landowner's land. They received a share of the crop, typically half, at harvest. They purchased their food and tools and seed on credit from the landowner, or from a merchant with whom the landowner had a relationship. Credit extended at interest rates that reflected the borrower's complete lack of alternatives. At harvest, the debt was subtracted from the share, at prices the landowner calculated, using measurements the landowner controlled, with records the landowner kept. The family rarely came out ahead. The family was often told they came out behind, in debt, which meant they were bound to the land for another year to work off the debt that the accounting showed they owed. The arrangement was not slavery. It was not intended to be identical to slavery. Its resemblance to slavery in its practical effects was noticed by the freed people living inside it immediately, and documented by investigators and journalists throughout the Reconstruction period. It was the economic foundation on which, after Reconstruction ended and the legal protections it had built were dismantled, something very like the antebellum order was reconstructed on the land. The Panic of 1873 was the economic crisis that changed the political atmosphere in which Reconstruction was operating. On September 18, 1873, the banking firm of J. Cook and Company, which had been the primary financier of Union war bonds and which had subsequently overextended itself in financing the Northern Pacific Railroad, declared bankruptcy. The failure triggered a cascade. Banks closed, railroad construction stopped. Unemployment in northern cities rose rapidly. The New York Stock Exchange closed for 10 days, the first and longest closure in its history up to that point. The economic depression that followed lasted approximately 6 years and was, until the Great Depression 60 years later, the worst economic crisis in American history. The political consequences for Reconstruction were devastating, though not immediately obvious as devastating. The Depression shifted the attention of Northern voters from the project of reforming the South to the project of managing their own economic circumstances. The Republican Party, which had built its post-war identity around the twin pillars of economic development and Reconstruction, found the economic pillar collapsing under the weight of the Depression and the Reconstruction pillar increasingly expensive to defend against Southern resistance that the Depression was making harder to fund. Northern newspapers that had supported Reconstruction in 1868 were questioning its cost by 1874. Northern voters who had elected Republican majorities committed to protecting black suffrage in 1872 were electing Democrats in 1874 by the hundreds. The Democrats took control of the House of Representatives for the first time since before the war. The political coalition that had made Reconstruction possible was fragmenting, not because its principles had been wrong, but because its material base was eroding, and because the resistance to it, as the next chapter will document, was more violent and more organized and more willing to do whatever was necessary to end it than anything that had been fully anticipated. The Grant administration's corruption scandals compounded the erosion. Credit Mobilier had broken in 1872, revealing that congressmen had accepted Union Pacific Railroad stock in exchange for favorable treatment of the railroad's government contracts. The Whiskey Ring Scandal, which broke in 1875, revealed systematic tax fraud in the whiskey industry, involving Treasury Department officials and implicating, though not convicting, Grant's own personal secretary. The scandals did not directly implicate Reconstruction, but they associated the Republican Party with exactly the corruption that Reconstruction's opponents were attributing to the Reconstruction governments in the South, making the Republican defense of those governments harder to mount without appearing to defend corruption more broadly. Grant was personally honest, as far as the historical record shows, which is to say that he did not personally profit from the scandals that his administration produced. He was a man of limited political sophistication in the presidency after demonstrating military genius in the field, and the combination of a depression and pervasive scandals, and a Southern resistance that was about to escalate to a level of violence that would force a direct confrontation between the federal government and what amounted to a paramilitary insurgency, was more than his administration's resources and political will were ultimately able to manage. But before we follow those events to their conclusion, the record of what was built deserves its moment without the shadow of what destroyed it. In the 8 years between the passage of the Reconstruction Acts and the beginning of the organized campaign that brought the Reconstruction governments down, the South experienced a democratic experiment of genuine achievement. Public schools where there had been no public schools. Public hospitals where there had been no public institutions for black citizens. Courts with black jurists rendering decisions in cases involving white parties. Legislatures with black majorities passing bills on tax policy and railroad development and labor protection and constitutional reform. A black man governing the state that had fired the first shots of the Civil War. A black man in the Senate seat that Jefferson Davis had vacated to lead the Confederacy. Black children learning to read in buildings their grandparents had built as enslaved laborers. Old men and old women who had been born into bondage attending school for the first time at 60 years old because they had decided that the years remaining were better spent knowing than not knowing. It was imperfect. No governance is perfect. It was impermanent. Its impermanence was not inherent but imposed. It was the product of genuine democratic participation by people who had been told their entire lives that democratic participation was not for them, and who had responded to that verdict the way people respond to verdicts delivered without legitimate authority. They ignored it. They voted by the millions in the window of time when their votes could be cast. They held office in the window of time when office was available to them. They built in the window that was available because the window was not going to stay open, and they understood that, and built with the urgency that understanding produces. John Roy Lynch would live long enough to write the book that proved the record was real. Jonathan Jasper Wright would practice law until the era he had helped build was thoroughly dismantled, and the profession he practiced was one from which the state he had served would spend the next 100 years trying to exclude men who looked like him. Robert Smalls would live until 1915, surviving Reconstruction by 38 years, long enough to see the world he had helped build legally disassembled around him by the same state whose constitution he had helped write, and whose soldiers had once had to bar him from his old congressional seat by physical force when he tried to attend a session of the legislature from which he had been politically excluded. He had stolen a Confederate ship in 1862 to deliver it to the Union. The Union had eventually given the Confederacy back everything the ship had cost. But not forever. That is the final thing to say about what Reconstruction built, the thing that the people who destroyed it and the historians who celebrated the destruction could never quite make disappear entirely. It established in constitutional amendments the framework that a later generation would use to demand what this generation had been denied. The 14th Amendment did not die with Reconstruction. The 15th Amendment did not die. The precedents of black governance, the documented record that black Americans could vote and legislate and adjudicate and govern with competence and with vision, could not be unmade by being ignored. It was in the record. John Roy Lynch made sure it stayed in the record. And 60 years after Lynch died, the children of the Great Migration and the grandchildren of the freed people looked at that record and used it, and the constitutional framework it had produced, to demand, again, what had been demanded before and taken away. What was taken away and how it was taken, and the specific brutality of the taking, is what comes next. In December 1865, 6 former Confederate officers gathered in a law office in Pulaski, Tennessee, and founded an organization they initially presented as a social club. They gave it a Greek-derived name, Ku Klux, meaning circle or band, anglicized into Ku Klux, and added Klan for alliterative effect, and because they were, most of them, of Scottish descent, and the word had the right sound. The costumes came early, white robes and masks and pointed hoods, theatrical in their design and deliberate in their purpose. The organization's founders understood something about fear that was specific to their moment and their intended audience. The freed people of the South had been controlled for generations, partly through the manipulation of their religious beliefs, through the specific terror of the supernatural that slavery had cultivated, and that the white South had deliberately encouraged because a population afraid of ghosts is easier to control than one that is not. The Klan's costumes were designed to appear ghostly, to suggest the spirits of Confederate dead returned to haunt a South that had surrendered its racial order, to invoke the specific dread that had been carefully planted in the people the costumes were designed to terrify. It was a cynical manipulation built on decades of deliberate psychological exploitation. It worked with a thoroughness that the people deploying it had calculated, and that the people subjected to it overcame with a courage that the history of Reconstruction in its full form documents clearly. The Klan spread across the former Confederacy with the speed of something filling a space that had been waiting for it. By 1868, it had chapters in every southern state, organized hierarchically with the theatrical vocabulary of the Confederacy's romanticism about itself, grand wizards and grand dragons and grand cyclopes and ghouls and nighthawks, the elaborate nomenclature of an organization that wanted its members to feel they belonged to something ancient and significant. The first grand wizard was Nathan Bedford Forrest. He was not a man who required introduction to the concept of organized violence against black people. In April 1864, as a Confederate general commanding cavalry at Fort Pillow, Tennessee, his forces had overrun a Union garrison approximately half of whose defenders were black soldiers. After the garrison surrendered, Forrest's men killed somewhere between 200 and 300 black soldiers and their white officers who had already laid down their arms. The massacre was investigated by Congress. The investigation produced a report that documented what had happened with witness testimony from survivors. Forrest testified that he had not ordered a massacre and had not been present when the worst of it occurred. The congressional investigators concluded that his testimony was not credible. He was not prosecuted. He was, after the war ended and Reconstruction began, chosen to lead the organization whose purpose was to do through terror what the war had failed to do through battle. The choice was not incidental to who he was. The Klan's methods were not mysterious. They were night riding, mounted men in costume, arriving at the homes of black voters, black office holders, black community leaders, Freedmen's Bureau agents, white Republican organizers, white teachers at bureau schools, any individual whose activities were identified as advancing Reconstruction. They came at night, between midnight and 4 in the morning, at the hour when the darkness and the costume and the theatrical invocation of the supernatural had maximum effect, when the family inside the house had no warning and no time to organize any response. They demanded that the man of the house come out. If he came out, he was beaten. If he had been organizing politically, he was beaten severely and warned that the next visit would end differently. If he had been particularly visible, a school principal, a local Republican official, a man who had spoken publicly about black rights, the warning was sometimes delivered with rope rather than words. If he didn't come out, they burned whatever was available to burn. The house, the barn, the crop, the thing most difficult to replace. They also killed. From 1868 through 1871, the period of the Klan's most organized activity, the number of people murdered by Klan members or Klan-affiliated groups across the former Confederacy runs into the hundreds. The specific number cannot be established with precision because most of the murders were not reported by white newspapers, were not investigated by local law enforcement, and were not prosecuted by state courts in which the jurors were white men who either belonged to the Klan or sympathized with its purposes. What can be established is the pattern. Republican candidates for office who refused to withdraw under Klan pressure were killed. Freedmen's Bureau agents who were particularly effective at protecting black workers' rights were killed. School teachers who had established bureau schools that the local white community found threatening were killed. Black men who had served in the Union Army and who demonstrated by the manner in which they carried themselves that they had not been returned to deference by the end of the war were specifically targeted. The Klan murdered a Republican congressman in Arkansas. It murdered a Republican judge in Georgia. It murdered black state legislators in several states. It murdered black men who owned land in counties where black land ownership was perceived as a threat to the labor arrangements that required black workers to have no alternatives. Arkansas's Republican governor, Powell Clayton, declared martial law in 10 counties in 1868 and used state militia to suppress the Klan there with meaningful success, one of the few examples in which a Reconstruction government had sufficient military resources and political will to directly confront the Klan's violence and reduce it. Most Reconstruction governors lacked the militia strength or the legal authority to do what Clayton did, and some of the militia that Reconstruction governments had raised were themselves targets of Klan violence, the black militias that armed freed people being a specific focus of Klan intimidation, because an armed black man was the thing the system of racial control that the Klan was defending had always been most afraid of. Ulysses Grant responded with the tools available to him. The Enforcement Act of 1870 made it a federal crime to interfere with citizens' voting rights, providing the legal mechanism to prosecute Klan members in federal courts, rather than the state courts that were not going to convict them. The Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 went further, making Klan conspiracy a federal offense and giving the president the authority to suspend habeas corpus in areas where the Klan's violence had produced a state of rebellion against federal authority. Grant used that authority in October 1871, suspending habeas corpus in 9 counties of South Carolina, where the Klan's operations had been most systematic and violent. Federal troops made mass arrests. Hundreds of Klan members were taken into custody. Dozens were tried in federal court. Some were convicted and sentenced to prison. The organized Klan structure in South Carolina was broken temporarily. Similar operations in Mississippi and other states produced similar temporary results. For a period in the early 1870s, it appeared possible that the federal government's direct intervention might succeed in suppressing the organized paramilitary campaign against Reconstruction. It did not succeed. Not because the intervention failed militarily. It failed politically. Prosecuting hundreds of Klan members required federal attorneys and federal courts and federal prison space and the sustained political will to continue the effort regardless of the cost in money and public attention. The Northern public's attention was finite and increasingly directed toward the depression that the Panic of 1873 had produced and toward the corruption scandals accumulating around the Grant administration. The professional class of the Republican Party, the editors and lawyers and businessmen who had supported Reconstruction, partly from principle and partly from the calculation that it served Republican political interests, was beginning to question whether the cost of maintaining it against organized Southern resistance was worth the diminishing political returns. The Klan, as an organization, was officially disbanded by Forrest in 1869, an act of public relations management, rather than genuine dissolution, because the organized structure had become a legal liability, while the activities it had organized continued through less formally organized channels. What replaced the Klan was more sophisticated, and in several respects more dangerous, because the successor organizations operated with the organizational clarity of men who had learned from the Klan's overexposure what worked and what attracted federal attention. The White League in Louisiana and the Red Shirts in South Carolina and Mississippi were not secret organizations in the costume and night riding sense. They operated openly. They organized as rifle clubs, explicitly paramilitary, carrying weapons publicly, drilling in public squares, making no particular effort to disguise their purpose, which was the armed suppression of black political participation and the overthrow of Reconstruction governments by whatever force was necessary. The openness was strategic. Secret organizations could be prosecuted under the Enforcement Acts. Men openly carrying rifles to a political rally occupied a different legal space that the courts had not yet fully addressed. The Colfax Massacre. Easter Sunday, April 13th, 1873, Grant Parish, Louisiana. It was the bloodiest single event of the Reconstruction era, and one of the worst episodes of racial violence in American history, and most Americans today have never heard of it. The background requires a sentence. Grant Parish had been carved out of existing Louisiana parishes specifically to create a Republican majority, and the town of Colfax, the parish seat, was named for the then Vice President, Schuyler Colfax. The November 1872 elections in Louisiana had produced disputed results, with both Republicans and Democrats claiming victory in the governor's race and in local offices, including the Grant Parish positions. Black Republicans in Colfax occupied the courthouse to defend the Republican claim to the local government. For 3 weeks they held it, a group of armed black men and a smaller number of white Republicans, waiting for a resolution that the state government was too contested to provide. On Easter Sunday, a force of somewhere between 300 and 400 armed white men arrived at Colfax. They were organized. They had a cannon. The defenders of the courthouse were outnumbered and outgunned. The battle lasted several hours. When the defenders attempted to surrender, they were shot. Approximately 50 black men were killed during the fighting, and an additional 50 to 100 were killed after they surrendered, executed by men who had been told, or who had decided on their own, that the surrender was not going to be accepted. Bodies were dumped in the Red River. 3 white men died. The total black death toll is estimated at between 100 and 150, though the uncertainty reflects the specific conditions under which the killings occurred, which were conditions in which the men doing the killing had no interest in accurate record-keeping. 97 men were indicted for their roles in the massacre. 3 were tried and convicted of violating the Enforcement Act. Their convictions were appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States. In 1876, the court issued its decision in United States versus Cruikshank, ruling that the federal indictments were defective because the 14th Amendment only prohibited state action, not private action. The men who had organized and executed a massacre of approximately 100 black people who had surrendered were not, the Supreme Court ruled, violating federal law because they were private citizens rather than state actors. The convictions were thrown out. None of the men involved in the Colfax Massacre spent a day in prison for what they had done. A historical marker was erected at the site of the massacre decades later. It described the event as a conflict that had ended carpetbag rule and commended the courage of the white men who had participated. The marker stood for most of the 20th century. The Supreme Court's Cruikshank decision was the jurisprudential foundation on which the destruction of Reconstruction was built. It established the principle that the federal government's authority to protect citizens' constitutional rights did not extend to violations committed by private individuals, regardless of the scale or the intent of the violation. In the same term, in United States versus Reese, the court gutted the 15th Amendment's practical application by ruling that Congress could not use the amendment to broadly protect voting rights, only to prohibit specific discriminatory acts that met a narrow legal standard. The two decisions together achieved what the Klan's violence had been attempting and had only partially accomplished. They told the former Confederate states that the federal government's tools for enforcing the Reconstruction amendments had a ceiling, and the ceiling was low enough that organized paramilitary violence operating just below it was effectively beyond federal reach. The White League understood this immediately. In September 1874, the New Orleans chapter of the White League organized an armed force of approximately 3,500 men and confronted the Louisiana Metropolitan Police and state militia in the streets of New Orleans. The resulting Battle of Liberty Place lasted less than 15 minutes. 11 police officers and state militia were killed. 16 White Leaguers died. The White League took control of the State House, the Arsenal, and the City Hall of New Orleans. The Reconstruction governor, William Pitt Kellogg, fled. For 3 days, the White League governed Louisiana. Federal troops arrived and restored order. Kellogg was reinstated. But the event had demonstrated something that everyone in the South and in Washington understood. A private paramilitary organization had successfully overthrown a state government by force of arms and held it for 3 days before federal intervention. The only thing preventing them from holding it permanently was the presence of federal troops. The question was how long those troops would remain. The White League had conducted its 3-day dress rehearsal. It knew the answer when the question was finally answered for real. The Mississippi Plan of 1875 was the template that the counter-revolution refined into its most effective form. It combined three elements that had been deployed separately before, and that together proved unstoppable: organized violence against Republican leaders and black voters, economic coercion of black workers, who were threatened with loss of employment and housing by white landowners if they voted Republican, and systematic ballot fraud, the stuffing of ballot boxes, the intimidation of election officials, the physical prevention of black voters from reaching polling places. The Mississippi Plan worked. The Democrats took control of the Mississippi state government in November 1875 with majorities that could not be explained by any demographic accounting of the state's electorate that did not include large-scale suppression of black voters. Governor Adelbert Ames appealed to Grant for federal troops to protect the election. Grant's attorney general, after consulting with Ohio Republicans who were worried that sending troops to Mississippi would cost them votes in their own state election happening simultaneously, advised against it. The troops were not sent. Mississippi fell. The Red Shirts of South Carolina operated with the brazenness of men who had watched the Mississippi Plan succeed and understood that the federal response had failed. Wade Hampton, the former Confederate general who was the Democratic candidate for governor of South Carolina in 1876, organized the Red Shirts openly as his campaign's paramilitary arm. They rode armed to Republican rallies and demanded equal time to address the crowds, a practice called dividing the time that translated in practice to the Red Shirts disrupting Republican events until their demands were met, then using the platform to intimidate black voters while armed men stood in visible proximity. They shot up black communities. They killed Republican officials. In Hamburg, South Carolina, in July 1876, Red Shirts surrounded the black militia captain Doc Adams and his company of about 40 men, demanding they surrender their weapons. When negotiations failed, the Red Shirts opened fire. 5 black militiamen were killed, several of them after they had been captured, executed by Red Shirts, who told them explicitly that they were being killed because they had voted Republican. Adams escaped into the woods and survived. The Hamburg Massacre was reported in northern newspapers. Wade Hampton continued his campaign. He was elected governor of South Carolina in November 1876. The election of 1876. Rutherford Hayes, the Republican candidate for president, versus Samuel Tilden, the Democrat. Hayes carried Ohio and the northern industrial states. Tilden won the South decisively because the Mississippi Plan and the Red Shirts and the White League had made winning the South by suppressing black votes the Democratic Party's standard operating procedure. The electoral vote count, when November's results were tabulated, showed Tilden with 184 electoral votes, one short of the majority needed. Hayes had 165. 20 electoral votes were disputed, from Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, the 3 states where Reconstruction governments still nominally operated, where federal troops were still nominally present, and where the election results were a chaos of fraud and counterfraud and violence and intimidation so extreme that no honest accounting of the actual votes cast was recoverable. Congress established an electoral commission, 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats, to adjudicate the disputed votes. The commission voted 8-7 along party lines to award all 20 disputed electoral votes to Hayes. The Democrats, who controlled the House, could have blocked the certification of the result. For several weeks, it appeared they might. Then the negotiations that were already happening more informally became more formal, and the arrangement that history calls the Compromise of 1877, though compromise is perhaps the most bloodless word available for what it actually was, took shape. Hayes would receive the presidency. In exchange, federal troops would be withdrawn from Louisiana and South Carolina, the last 2 states where Reconstruction governments still held power under military protection. The specific assurances given to Southern Democrats about the treatment of the South were vaguer than the troop withdrawal, but the troop withdrawal was the thing that mattered. The troops were what stood between the Reconstruction governments and the armed men who had been trying to overthrow them for a decade. Remove the troops, and the result was not in question. Hayes was inaugurated in March 1877. The troops were ordered out of the Louisiana State House in April. The Reconstruction government of Louisiana collapsed the same day. The troops were ordered out of South Carolina in April. Wade Hampton's Red Shirt government which had been waiting since his contested election in November, took full control of South Carolina immediately. Jonathan Jasper Wright resigned from the South Carolina Supreme Court within a year, under circumstances that left the nature of the pressure applied to him a matter of historical inference rather than documentation, which is itself a description of how the dismantling worked, quietly, through pressures that left no explicit record of coercion, because the coercion did not need to be explicit when the alternative to resignation was visible enough. PBS Pinchback's claims to the Louisiana Senate seat to which he had been elected were disputed and delayed for 3 years, and ultimately rejected by the Senate itself, which had seated him temporarily as a visitor to his own chamber. He never took the seat he had been elected to. Blanche Bruce finished his Senate term in 1881 and was not replaced by a black senator for 86 years. The Redeemer governments, as they called themselves, with the self-conscious mythology of men who understood that naming the thing you are doing shapes how history records it, moved quickly. Not violently at this stage, because violence was no longer necessary. The mechanism was law. Voting laws, registration requirements, poll taxes, literacy tests administered at the discretion of white registrars. The specific mechanisms that would be fully implemented over the following 2 decades, and that would complete the disfranchisement that the violence of the previous decade had prepared. The infrastructure of what became Jim Crow was built on the foundation that the counter-revolution had cleared. The clearing had required the Klan and the White League, and the Red Shirts, and the Colfax Massacre, and the Hamburg Massacre, and the Mississippi Plan, and the Battle of Liberty Place, and the Supreme Court's evisceration of the Enforcement Acts, and ultimately a presidential bargain in which black Americans were used, as they had been used in 1877, as the currency of a deal between white men who had decided that what black Americans needed was not relevant to what white men wanted. Frederick Douglass called the Compromise of 1877 the most flagrant betrayal of the freed people since emancipation. He had watched the entire arc from inside it, from the 1840s when he was a fugitive from slavery, delivering anti-slavery speeches in Massachusetts, to the 1870s when he was the most prominent black man in the country and the most articulate voice for what was being lost. He understood, with the precision of someone who had spent 40 years thinking about the relationship between promise and betrayal in American racial politics, exactly what had happened and exactly what it meant. He said that the nation had been moved by what he called the slavery of custom, the deep-rooted preference for the comfortable arrangement, the path of least resistance that led back toward the order that had been disrupted, and that too many people found it easier to restore than to maintain the disruption. He kept making the argument. He was in his 60s. He kept making it because the argument was right, and because the people who most needed to hear it were the people who most needed to be kept from forgetting that the argument had ever been made. The men who had been elected to the Mississippi legislature in 1870 were not in the Mississippi legislature by 1878. The men who had served in the South Carolina House and Senate during Reconstruction were not serving by 1878. The black registrations in Alabama that had constituted a majority of the electorate during Reconstruction were being systematically reduced by registration administrators who applied literacy tests with a flexibility that ensured the outcome regardless of the applicant's actual literacy. The Reconstruction state constitutions were replaced by new constitutions explicitly designed to circumvent the 14th and 15th Amendments while nominally complying with their text. Mississippi held a constitutional convention for this purpose in 1890. The delegates said what they were doing clearly enough in the official proceedings that no one listening needed to speculate about intent. They were disenfranchising black voters. They said so. They succeeded. Within 10 years, the black vote in Mississippi had been reduced to statistical invisibility. What it had taken federal troops and constitutional amendments and years of Republican political management to build, the counter-revolution dismantled in a decade without the troops and without the amendments being repealed, and without the Supreme Court saying a word about what was happening to the constitutional framework it was charged with protecting. The Supreme Court would say a word in 1883. The civil rights cases of that year consolidated 5 challenges to the Civil Rights Act of 1875, the act that Sumner had died trying to pass, and that Congress had passed in his memory. The court ruled 8-1 that the act was unconstitutional. The 14th Amendment prohibited state discrimination, not the discrimination of private individuals. Hotels, theaters, railroad cars. Their owners' choices about whom to serve were private choices. The federal government had no authority to regulate them. The one dissent was written by Justice John Marshall Harlan, a former enslaver from Kentucky who had opposed the 13th Amendment and who had experienced somewhere in the years between his antebellum position and his Supreme Court tenure a change of constitutional understanding that he articulated in his civil rights cases dissent with a clarity and a fury that stands as one of the great documents of American jurisprudence. He wrote that the substance and spirit of the Reconstruction Amendments were being sacrificed by a subtle and ingenious verbal criticism. He wrote that the majority was too narrowly construing a document designed to protect a specific people from a specific history of oppression. He wrote that the 13th Amendment was not merely a prohibition on the formal institution of slavery, but a prohibition on all badges and incidents of slavery. He was alone in writing this. He was right. It took the court 80 years to catch up. The counter-revolution was complete by 1883. What it had required was 10 years of organized political violence, the selective application of federal power that stopped short of what was actually necessary, a Supreme Court that read the Reconstruction Amendments narrowly enough to drain them of their practical effect, a presidential bargain that traded black political rights for political convenience, and the exhaustion of Northern public will for a project that had always been more expensive and more difficult than its proponents had fully acknowledged when they began it. The Reconstruction governments were gone. The black office holders were gone, or nearly gone, or in the process of being removed through mechanisms that the new constitutional framework of the Southern states was producing. The schools and the hospitals and the public institutions that Reconstruction had built were being taken over by governments that had no interest in maintaining them for the people they had been built to serve. What remained was the constitutional framework, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment. They had been written into the Constitution in ways that required another constitutional amendment to remove, and the political mathematics of that process meant they were going to remain in the Constitution, regardless of how narrowly the Supreme Court interpreted them. They remained dormant, their practical application suspended by the jurisprudence that had drained them, and the violence that had made their enforcement politically too expensive to sustain. They remained, waiting for the moment when someone would look at the text and see in it not what the Cruikshank court had found, but what Harlan had seen in his dissent. An instrument. Imperfect, limited, drafted in compromise, but still an instrument. An instrument for the thing it had been drafted to do, which had not been done, and which remained undone. The moment would come. It would take most of a century, and the people who brought it would look back at what had been built during Reconstruction and what had been done to it, and would understand that the fight they were fighting was not a new fight. It was the same fight. Interrupted. Resumed. The lie that made the interruption comfortable was next, and the lie lasted longer than the interruption. The lie needed a name before it could do its full work. It got one. The Lost Cause. The phrase itself was the first act of mythology, converting a failed rebellion in defense of slavery into something with the romantic weight of tragedy. Something noble defeated, not by the better argument, but by the larger army. Something whose loss the South was entitled to mourn, and the nation was obligated to respect. The Lost Cause was not primarily a lie about the Civil War, though it lied about that too, insisting that slavery had been a minor cause of secession, rather than the thing that secession's own architects had declared in their secession documents and their cornerstone speeches was its entire reason for being. The Lost Cause's most consequential and most durable fabrication was its lie about Reconstruction, because the Civil War was over. Reconstruction was an ongoing argument about what the peace meant and who got to define it. The Lost Cause needed to win that argument permanently, and winning it required a specific story. The story was this: Reconstruction had been a catastrophe, a corrupt imposition by vindictive Northern politicians who used ignorant freedmen and unprincipled scalawags to punish the defeated South. A period of misrule and pillage and racial inversion so damaging that the men who ended it by force, the Redeemers, the Klansmen, the Red Shirts, the men of the White League, deserved to be understood not as violent suppressors of democratic government, but as heroes restoring civilization. The story was false in every important particular. It was constructed, taught, and enforced with a thoroughness that most deliberate falsehoods never achieve. The construction began with organization. The United Daughters of the Confederacy, founded in 1894, became the primary institutional mechanism through which the lost cause mythology was translated from the preferences of the former Confederate leadership class into the curriculum of American schools. The UDC was not a fringe organization. At its peak, it had approximately 100,000 members in chapters across the country, including chapters in northern states, and it operated with the specific focus of an organization that understood that the generation of people who had lived through the war and Reconstruction was dying, and that the generation replacing them would know only what they were taught. What they were taught was the UDC's priority. The organization lobbied state legislatures and school boards and textbook publishers and library committees to ensure that the version of history used in classrooms reflected the lost cause interpretation. It was successful with a completeness that has few parallels in the history of organized historical revisionism. The textbooks that resulted described Reconstruction in language that owed nothing to the documentary record and everything to the political needs of the moment. Freed people were portrayed as childlike at best, savage at worst, incapable of self-governance, manipulated by corrupt Northerners who had used them as instruments of revenge, rather than as citizens with legitimate political interests. The Reconstruction governments were described as kleptocracies. Their genuine achievements in public education and institutional development simply omitted or attributed to white Republican allies rather than to the black legislators who had driven them. The Redeemers were heroes. The Klan, in the gentler versions, was barely mentioned. In others, it was justified, the natural response of a civilization defending itself against the chaos that radical Republican misrule had produced. The children who learned American history from these textbooks in the early decades of the 20th century, in the South and increasingly in the North, where Northern publishers adopted Southern textbook requirements to capture Southern markets, were not learning a contested interpretation. They were learning a story presented as settled fact, with the authority of school and the imprimatur of certified educators, and the weight of an entire cultural apparatus dedicated to its maintenance. William Archibald Dunning taught history at Columbia University. He was not a polemicist. He was an academic, operating within the professional standards of his era and the interpretation of Reconstruction he developed, and that his students elaborated across a generation of scholarship was, by those standards, documented and argued. It was also wrong in ways that required the selective use of sources, the dismissal of black testimony and black political agency as inherently unreliable, the acceptance of white Southern accounts of Reconstruction as objective, while treating black and Republican accounts as partisan, the fundamental assumption that the people who had been enslaved were not capable of the kind of political judgment that the documentary record showed them exercising. The Dunning School interpretation dominated academic American history for the first half of the 20th century. Its students produced the standard works on Reconstruction that sat on university library shelves as authoritative references. The political and social world those works described existed in the documents they chose to read, and in the assumptions they brought to the reading. The documents that contradicted the interpretation were available. The Dunning scholars simply did not find them useful. Claude Bowers was not an academic. He was a journalist and a Democratic Party politician who had been present at the 1924 Democratic National Convention, and who in 1929 published a book called The Tragic Era that brought the Dunning School interpretation to the widest possible popular audience. The book described Reconstruction in the terms that the UDC had been developing for 30 years. The corrupt carpetbaggers, the ignorant freedmen, the prostrate South, the heroic redeemers, rendered in prose that was vivid enough and partisan enough to function as entertainment rather than history. Franklin Roosevelt read it and called it a great book, which tells you something about the reach of the mythology across political lines that Americans prefer to think of as separating attitudes about race. The tragic era went through multiple printings. It shaped the understanding of Reconstruction held by millions of Americans who would never read an academic history and who formed their understanding of the era from the most accessible narrative available, which was the one that had been constructed most carefully and distributed most widely by the people with the greatest interest in its acceptance. Thomas Dixon Jr. had written the novel that became the source for the most influential artifact the Lost Cause mythology produced. The Klansman, published in 1905, was an explicit celebration of the Ku Klux Klan, presenting its hooded riders as the saviors of white Southern civilization against the specific threat of black male sexuality, which Dixon described with a luridness that reflected both his personal obsessions and the propaganda needs of a mythology that required a specific fear to justify specific violence. Dixon was a Baptist minister from North Carolina, a man who had known personally some of the figures he was fictionalizing, who understood the emotional architecture of the story he was telling, and who had no apparent hesitation about the moral character of what he was doing. He dedicated the book to his uncle, a former Klan member. He wanted his readers to understand what the Klan had done as heroic, and he succeeded. David Wark Griffith was a Kentucky-born filmmaker who had been making short films for several years when he acquired the rights to Dixon's novel and decided that its story deserved a new medium's full technical resources. The Birth of a Nation, released in February 1915, was the first feature-length film in American history. It was also a technical masterpiece, introducing editing techniques and camera movements that would define the grammar of cinema for decades. It was also the most effective piece of white supremacist propaganda the 20th century produced, presenting Reconstruction through Dixon's lens, with the Klan as its heroes and black political participation as its horror, to audiences who had no competing cinematic framework and who received what they saw with the credulous intensity that the new medium's illusion of reality produced in viewers who had not yet developed the skeptical habits that media literacy requires. The film played in theaters across the country. It played in the White House. On the evening of February 18, 1915, Woodrow Wilson became the first president to screen a film in the White House when The Birth of a Nation was shown in the East Room for Wilson, his cabinet, and their families. Wilson's purported reaction, that the film was like writing history with lightning, has been disputed by some historians as an attribution without reliable sourcing. What is not disputed is that Wilson did not publicly object to the film's content, did not repudiate its historical interpretation, and that his administration was at that moment actively segregating the federal workforce, reversing the integration that had been achieved during Reconstruction and maintained through the decades since. Wilson was a Virginian who had written his own academic work on Reconstruction in the Dunning School tradition, describing black suffrage as a great corruption, a view he held with the professional confidence of a man who had studied the question at Johns Hopkins and whose conclusions aligned precisely with what his political instincts and his cultural formation had already told him was true. William Joseph Simmons watched The Birth of a Nation and founded the second Ku Klux Klan on Thanksgiving night, 1915, on the granite face of Stone Mountain, Georgia, 15 miles east of Atlanta. He burned a cross. He inducted 15 members. Within 10 years, the Klan he founded had between 3 and 6 million members. It was present in Indiana, in Ohio, in Oregon, in California, in states that had never been Confederate territory, because the mythology that Birth of a Nation had distributed was not a regional mythology. It was a national one, available to anyone who needed the specific combination of racial anxiety and organizational belonging and violent purpose that the Klan offered. The Second Klan marched in Washington, D.C. in 1925 with approximately 30,000 members in full regalia down Pennsylvania Avenue, past the Capitol, in the capital of the country whose founding documents declared all men created equal. Nobody stopped them. It was a permitted parade. The Confederate monuments went up, not immediately after the war, as their presence in southern landscapes might suggest to a casual observer. The timing of their installation is one of the most documented and most revealing facts about what the monuments were actually for. The Southern Poverty Law Center documented in a comprehensive study that the installation of Confederate monuments on public land peaked in two specific periods. The first was approximately 1900 to 1920, the period of Jim Crow's full consolidation, when the legal and social architecture of racial subordination was being completed and needed architectural markers to anchor its legitimacy in public space. The second was approximately 1954 to 1965, the period of the Civil Rights Movement, when the architecture of racial subordination was being challenged and needed visible assertion of permanence to resist the challenge. The monuments were not memorials to the dead. Memorials to the dead are built when the grief is fresh. These were built when the grief was 30 and 50 years old. Built not for the dead, but for the living, specifically for the black living, who were meant to understand from the stone and bronze presence of Confederate generals in courthouse squares and statehouse grounds what the political order of the place they lived in was and intended to remain. The monument to the perpetrators of the Colfax Massacre, installed in 1921 in Grant Parish, Louisiana, described the men who had killed approximately 150 black people, who had surrendered as heroes, who had fallen in the Colfax riot in defense of white supremacy and home rule. It did not describe what home rule meant. It did not need to. The inscription was in the town square. Everyone in the town square could read it. Everyone in the town square understood. W.E.B. Du Bois published Black Reconstruction in America in 1935. It was 700 pages long, and it was one of the greatest works of American historical scholarship ever produced, and it was largely ignored by the mainstream academic history profession for approximately 3 decades. Du Bois had read the Dunning School. He had read the primary sources that the Dunning scholars claimed to have read. He had found in those same sources a completely different history from the one the Dunning School had constructed, because he had read them with different assumptions about whose testimony was credible and whose political agency was worth taking seriously. He documented the achievements of the Reconstruction governments in the exhaustive detail that 700 pages allows. He documented the counter-revolution. He documented the systematic destruction of what had been built, and the construction of the mythology that justified the destruction. He named the mythology clearly. He called the Dunning School's work one of the most stupendous efforts the world had ever seen to rewrite history for the purposes of propaganda. He was right. His book sat on library shelves, cited by a small number of scholars who knew it was right, largely absent from the undergraduate syllabi and the graduate reading lists that shaped the professional historical consensus, until the civil rights era forced a reckoning with what that consensus had been built on. Eric Foner published Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution in 1988, the definitive modern history of the era, the book that synthesized decades of revisionist scholarship and primary source research into the comprehensive account that the Dunning School had never produced, because the Dunning School had not been trying to produce a comprehensive account. It had been trying to produce a justification. Foner's book was 560 pages of documentation, of legislative records and newspaper accounts and personal correspondence and census data, and the same Freedmen's Bureau records that the Dunning scholars had dismissed as biased, reading them as what they were, which was evidence, and finding in them the history that Du Bois had found 50 years earlier, confirmed now by the full apparatus of professional historical method that the Dunning School had claimed to represent, and had in fact perverted. The constitutional framework survived. That is the fact that the lie, for all its thoroughness, could not make disappear, because constitutional amendments require constitutional amendments to remove, and the political mathematics of amendment had not been available to the counter-revolution. The 14th and 15th Amendments remained in the Constitution throughout the decades, when they were being practically nullified by the Supreme Court's narrow interpretations and the Southern states' creative circumventions. They remained because Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner and the Radical Republicans had understood in 1866 and 1868 that statute was insufficient and that only constitutional text could survive the political cycles that would bring Reconstruction's enemies to power. They had been right about that. The constitutional text survived, waiting. Thurgood Marshall spent 2 decades building the legal strategy that would use what had survived. Marshall was the grandson of an enslaved man, educated at Howard University's law school under the instruction of Charles Hamilton Houston, the architect of the NAACP's litigation strategy, who had understood that the 14th Amendment had not been killed by the Cruikshank Court and the civil rights case's decisions, only narrowed, and that the narrowing could be challenged case by case, building precedent on precedent, until the original intention of the amendment's framers was restored to constitutional life. Marshall argued 32 cases before the Supreme Court of the United States and won 29 of them, each one using the 14th Amendment as its constitutional foundation, each one reclaiming a piece of what the post-Reconstruction Court had given away. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously in Brown v. Board of Education that racially segregated public schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The Equal Protection Clause that John Bingham had drafted in 1866, the clause that the Cruikshank Court had read so narrowly it could barely function, the clause that 8 justices in the civil rights cases of 1883 had interpreted to mean the federal government was powerless against private discrimination. That clause. The same words in the same amendment, now read by a unanimous court to mean what the men who wrote it had always said it meant: that the government of the United States could not, through any of its instrumentalities, treat its citizens differently on the basis of race. The Dunning School's interpretation of Reconstruction had not survived contact with the amendment that Reconstruction had produced. The amendment had outlasted the interpretation. John Lewis was 25 years old on March 7, 1965, when he led approximately 600 marchers across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. The bridge was named for a United States Senator who had been a Grand Dragon of the Alabama Ku Klux Klan. On the other side of the bridge were Alabama state troopers with clubs and tear gas who attacked the marchers without warning, fracturing Lewis's skull, driving the column back across the bridge, producing images that were broadcast on national television that evening, and that interrupted the network airing of Judgment at Nuremberg to reach an audience of 48 million people who watched, on the same screen, a film about what happens when a society organizes itself around the premise that certain people are less than human, and then footage from a bridge in Alabama. The Voting Rights Act was signed by Lyndon Johnson on August 6, 1965. It prohibited the voting discrimination that the 15th Amendment had prohibited in 1870, and that the Southern states had been practicing since 1877, through mechanisms the 15th Amendment's text didn't explicitly prohibit. The act sent federal registrars to Southern counties. Within months, Black voter registration in the Deep South increased by numbers that made the subsequent political history of the South immediately different from what it had been. The Voting Rights Act was what the 15th Amendment had always been intended to produce, and had not produced, because the political will to enforce it had been traded away in 1877 for a presidency. The wheel had completed its turn. It had taken 88 years. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the Civil Rights Act of 1875, restored, expanded, properly enforced. The act that Charles Sumner had died trying to pass, and that the Supreme Court had struck down in 1883, was law again, with mechanisms for enforcement that the 1875 Act had lacked, and with a political consensus behind it that the Reconstruction-era Act had never fully achieved. The men and women of the civil rights movement who marched and sat in and went to jail and were beaten and killed to produce the legal changes of the mid-1960s were completing what the men and women of Reconstruction had started. They understood this. John Lewis understood this. He had read the history. He knew whose work he was resuming and why it was still not finished. The Confederate monuments began to come down in the 2000s and accelerated after the murder of 9 black parishioners at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, in June 2015, by a young white man who had made photographs of himself with Confederate battle flags his chosen imagery. South Carolina removed the Confederate battle flag from its State House grounds within weeks of the massacre. New Orleans removed 4 Confederate monuments in 2017 after years of political struggle. Virginia began removing statues from Monument Avenue in Richmond, the former Confederate capital, in 2020, following the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. The removals were contested everywhere they happened, which is itself information about the monument's function. A monument to a purely historical figure, a monument placed for purely memorial purposes, does not produce the intensity of political resistance that the Confederate monuments produced when their removal was proposed. The resistance demonstrated that the monuments were not primarily about the past, they were about the present, about who the community they stood in was choosing to honor, and what that choice declared about whose history was valued and whose was not, and who was welcome in the public space the monument occupied, and who was being told, in stone and bronze, that the space had been claimed by people who did not consider them equal. The 1619 Project, published by the New York Times Magazine in August 2019, proposed reframing American history with the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in Virginia in 1619 as a foundational date, arguing that slavery and its legacy were more central to American history than the conventional narrative acknowledged. The political reaction it produced, including executive orders from the Trump administration, directing federal agencies not to use its framework. Legislation in multiple state legislatures attempting to prohibit its use in public school curricula, the formation of a counter-project by historians challenging its specific claims, was a reaction to something the project had done that the Dunning School and the UDC had also understood was important. It had attempted to change the story. The violence of the response confirmed what the attempt had always known, that the story is not incidental to the politics. The story is the politics. What a society tells itself about its past determines what it believes is normal in its present and what it considers possible in its future. The fight over what story is told about Reconstruction, about slavery, about the Civil War and its aftermath, is not a fight about the past. It is a fight about the present, conducted in the language of history, because history is the available vocabulary for arguments about who we are and what we owe each other. Frederick Douglass said in 1869 that the arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. He was quoting Theodore Parker, the abolitionist minister, and he was saying it in the middle of Reconstruction when the arc seemed to be bending in the right direction, before the counter-revolution had fully organized, before the Colfax Massacre, before the Compromise of 1877. He may have said it with more confidence than he felt. He had been alive long enough to know that the arc bent in multiple directions, depending on who was pulling it, and how hard and what they were willing to do to hold it where they had pulled it. He had watched what happened at Edisto Island when the freed people were told the land was being given back. He had been in the room with Andrew Johnson. He knew what the arc was capable of. He kept saying it bent toward justice because the alternative to saying that was the alternative to hope, and he was not going to offer that to the people listening to him, not because it would have been dishonest, but because it would have been useless. The arc bent toward the Compromise of 1877. It bent toward the Colfax Massacre and the Supreme Court ruling that the massacre was not a federal crime. It bent toward the textbooks that described Reconstruction as a tragedy of black misrule. It bent toward Birth of a Nation and the Klan marching down Pennsylvania Avenue and the monuments going up in courthouse squares at exactly the moments when black Americans were making their most visible claims to equality. It bent toward the grandfather clauses and the literacy tests and the poll taxes and the 50 years of legally enforced apartheid that followed the counter-revolution. And then it bent the other way, toward Brown, toward the Voting Rights Act, toward the removal of monuments that should never have been built, toward the serious and belated reckoning with a history that had been deliberately buried by people who understood that the burial served their interests. The reckoning is incomplete. It was always going to be incomplete, because reckonings with histories this large and this consequential do not complete themselves in a generation. The constitutional framework that Reconstruction produced is still the framework within which every civil rights claim is made. The 14th Amendment is still the most litigated provision of the Constitution. The arguments about what it means and what it requires are still being made in federal courts in every circuit in the country. The Voting Rights Act that completed the 15th Amendment's promise in 1965 was partially struck down by the Supreme Court in Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, with the majority ruling that the formula Congress had used to determine which states required federal preclearance of voting law changes was outdated. States that had been covered by the preclearance requirement immediately began passing voting restrictions that the preclearance requirement had been preventing. The wheel turned again. What Reconstruction built was real. What destroyed it was real. The lie constructed to justify the destruction was real and was consequential in ways that lasted a century and are not fully exhausted. The constitutional framework that survived the destruction was real and became the instrument of the civil rights movement and remains the instrument of every claim to equal treatment under law that any American makes in any federal court today. All of these things are simultaneously true, and none of them resolves the others. What remains, after the full accounting that this documentary has attempted, is not a comfortable conclusion. The revolution that Reconstruction represented, the genuine multiracial democratic experiment that produced black senators and black governors and public school systems and constitutional amendments, and the specific hope that the country might actually become what it claimed to be, was real. Its destruction was organized, violent, systematic, and covered by a lie so comprehensive and so carefully maintained that most Americans spent most of the 20th century knowing the lie better than the truth. The truth is available now in the scholarship that Du Bois pioneered and Foner completed, and a generation of historians has confirmed. It is available in the archives, in the congressional records, in the Freedmen's Bureau documents, in the newspapers and the letters, and the legislative journals of the Reconstruction governments themselves. Robert Smalls is in those records. Blanche Bruce is in those records. Jonathan Jasper Wright is in those records. Hiram Revels, in Jefferson Davis's seat, is in those records. They built something. The counter-revolution destroyed most of it. The Constitution they amended survived, and became the instrument by which the next generation rebuilt what had been destroyed. The generation after that is still rebuilding. The work is not finished. The work has never been finished. The question Reconstruction asked, whether the United States would actually be what it said it was, has not been answered. It has been partially answered, in fits and starts, and with terrible reversals, across a century and a half of argument and violence and legal contest, and political struggle. It is being answered right now, incompletely, in the same terms, using the same constitutional framework, with the same counterforces arrayed against it, and the same insistence from the people who need the answer to be yes, that no is not acceptable. That it was not acceptable in 1866. That it was not acceptable in 1954. That it is not acceptable now. Hiram Revels walked into the United States Senate chamber in 1870 and sat in the seat that Jefferson Davis had vacated to lead the Confederacy. He was there for 1 year. The question of whether a man like him should be in that seat, and in the seats around it, and in the legislatures and the courts and the governor's mansions and all the institutions of democratic self-governance, has been fought over ever since. Fought over with arguments and with bullets, and with constitutional amendments, and with Supreme Court decisions, and with burning churches, and with civil rights legislation, and with voting restrictions, and with monuments, and with their removal, and with textbooks, and with their revision. The question is still open. The fight over how it gets answered is still the fight. Everything described in this documentary is not background to that fight. It is the fight. The same fight resumed. Still going.